Okay, so here we are at part 2, which is going to be as fast as I can go with a short history of the Jews. They have a long history, but I want to try and sketch in the broad strokes and leave the most amount of time this time for talking about the last lecture, which will be on how we got the Hebrew scriptures. So, go way back, the Levant, which is this area of the Near East. We often call it the Middle East, and this is circa 1500 BCE. There are some slides for you to review as part of your reading. They're data visualizations, and I'd love for you to spend more time with those so you can really get a sense of how these things work in history. So in this area, we have ancient Mesopotamia, and then we have a couple of other empires, and then you can see here we have this sort of land of Canaan. So this is where we're at when we're talking about the very earliest events of the Hebrew scriptures. And then, so Abraham ostensibly was born in Babylon and lived in Babylon before being promised that he would be the father of a nation. And then it's this long delay between when this promise is made to him and when Jacob comes to Israel, and then his sons end up going to Egypt during a famine during a famine in Canaan. So this is where they escape to, and then it's from here, and there's debate on how long the Israelites stayed in Egypt before the Exodus, but we do seem to have a pretty firm date on when the Exodus happened, which is 1440-ish BCE. So that's going to be important because earliest on, right, in the 1440s, this is really where the tradition of the Hebrews and their record of their own traditions as a separate people. This is where it all congeals, and it does that with Moses in particular. So Moses leads the Exodus, and then there is the conquest of Canaan. Now, one of the things that's really key here about the movement of the Hebrews both into and out of Egypt is that they marked themselves as different from the people around them, so that Judaism was not just a monolatrous religion similar to other religions in Canaan at the time, but it is also an ethnic identity. So when you read the Levitical laws, those laws were all designed specifically to set apart the Jews from their neighbors, right? So they had different customs, and therefore it was really difficult for Jews to assimilate into other cultures, which meant that it was also really difficult for them to disappear as a people when other folks took over, right? So they had a very centralized or core identity. So when they end up in Egypt, not only is it their oppression, but it's also their ethnic and religious identity that keep them unified as a people, and therefore needing let out of Egypt in the 15th century BCE. So there's the Exodus. That goes on for quite a long while, and Moses does not get a chance to see the end of the Exodus, but around 1400 is when you have the conquest of Canaan. Y'all are going to read about that in the book of Joshua. So that's part of the reading this week. And right after they establish themselves in Canaan, you have the period called the Judges, or the period of the Judges, where Israel is ruled by wise spiritual leaders. Some judges are even women. And these judges, they not only maintain order, but they also offer guidance to the nation of Israel. But other folks in the area are like, have kings. And so the Israelites, well, we want kings. And they go through this process of being like, yeah, we'll choose a king. And they choose a crappy king. And then God's like, are you sure? How about you want my choice now? It's a whole thing. Saul, not so cool. David, better. And this is the monarchical period. And David's son Solomon, who famously builds the first temple, Those three rulers are part of the monarchical period. But unfortunately, after the death of Solomon and a few times before, there is civil war, right? The Israelites cannot get along. There's 12 tribes of them, and for whatever reason, they can't all 12 do the same thing. And so you have a civil war between Judah, which is the kingdom around Jerusalem, and that is descended from the tribe of Judah and one of Jacob's 12 sons. And Judah is the kind of core kingdom, and that's where Jerusalem and the temple are. But then the northern kingdom of Israel is like 10 other, it's like Judah and Benjamin versus all the other 10. Right. So this is how this ends up being split. In the Philistine states, you'll notice that's actually where modern day Gaza is. And this area then becomes divided up, and there are two different rules at that point in time. Now, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, it gets conquered by Assyria in the 8th century BCE, and under that conquest, they end up having really the first exile, but that exile doesn't hit Jerusalem because Jerusalem isn't, Assyrian exile. So folks from specifically, so we're looking at the purple lines here, from this northern area, they're brought up into Nineveh in particular, and into these areas of northern Mesopotamia, and brought out of their lands, because removal of people from lands is one of the first ways to make sure that the land can stay conquered, right? If you leave the indigenous people in the places where they belong, they have more resources and more spirit, and are therefore more likely to hang on to their identity and foment rebellion. So, how to make an empire 101. But then after that, you have the Babylonian Empire, who they conquer the Assyrian Empire and everybody else, and then they also make sure that they conquer Jerusalem as well, and that is what leads to the second exile, which is the end of Judah and its kingdom in 587 BCE, and they destroy the temple and they exile all of the Jews to Babylon. So under these circumstances, we're going to come back around to this, but it is under these circumstances that Israel has to start thinking about monotheism and paving a new relationship for themselves to their God, because otherwise what this tactic will do is it will often assimilate the conquered people into the conquering culture, right? So assimilate the Jews into Babylonian culture, for example, because when you live alongside one another, long enough, you tend to have to end up intermarrying and adopting each other's customs and languages, and then the conquered culture often just disappears as it gets absorbed by the conquering culture. Well, we've already talked about how Judaism was an ethnic identity as well as a religion, and that many of their practices were specifically against assimilation. So when you have these Jews who are exiled in Babylon, rather than assimilate into the Babylonian culture, they actually hold to themselves pretty tightly, because it's really hard to assimilate with your neighbors if you can't go to your neighbor's house for dinner, for example, because you have really strict dietary laws and they don't. Or if you can't participate in certain cultural or social rituals because they're against the code of your religious practice. So that becomes a key reason why the Jewish identity perseveres even under these circumstances of conquest and exile. And over time, it becomes increasingly important to maintain that identity as Jews move through history. So here's a map of exactly how that Babylonian exile worked. So we had our first exile into Assyria, and then our second exile into Babylon. And then, as we mentioned earlier, then Persia comes in, right? And what that means for the Jews is Persia is very, very antithetical to everything Babylonian, right? Like they have a real chip on their shoulder about being better than Babylon. And so they are kind of contrarian, which means that as soon as Cyrus becomes the king, the emperor, and has power over the Jews in Babylon, and his conquest reaches all the way to Jerusalem, he actually offers them permission to rebuild the temple, to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. And that's how we get the Second Temple period. And then after this, the Persian Empire doesn't really last all that long. But you do have the next great emperor comes in, and that is Alexander the Great. And like others that we have discussed, Alexander's legacy only lasts as long as he does in some senses. So his empire expands, it becomes absolutely massive. But then once he dies, the whole thing collapses. But the one good thing that, there's maybe not one, but one of the positive outcomes from Alexander's conquest is, aside from the founding of a bunch of cities named Alexandria, he also merges together certain cultures that previously weren't necessarily all interacting. So yes, you had exchange between Persia and Babylon, and yes, you had exchange between Babylon and Jerusalem, and yes, you had exchange between Jerusalem and Egypt, but you didn't really have all of those things exchanging ideas and goods with each other, not on a large scale. And then you definitely didn't add to that the Greeks. Right? Whoa, left field. Here we go. Alexander brings in the Greeks, and then all of those cultures, I don't want to say meld together, but instead they become cultures of exchange, and they learn from each other. And so you actually have this massive flowering of learning under Hellenism. This is not classical Greek antiquity. It's a little bit late for that, but it is this moment of intellectual and cultural productivity that is really, really interesting. And under this exchange of goods and ideas, you actually have a high degree of tolerance for people with different belief systems and cultural practices. So it's one of the periods of history that had the lowest amount of anti-Semitism, which does not mean none, but lower. And then Rome. Right, so just when you think things are stabilizing, Alexander's gone, but Hellenism is still around, then the Romans are coming in, and you're just like, okay, new empire, yay. Now the Romans originally are polytheists, and so when they get to the Canaanite region, the land of Israel, they enter this space and they're like, okay, do your thing, I guess, with your one God. It's not like it was unheard of. They've encountered other cultures where people talked about having a single God, but really the Jews were the only ones. And because they're the only ones, and because they are conquered, there's not a ton of fuss made about it on either side. The Jews do not like being conquered, which is why they have a strong tradition of messianic action. And there are a number of people who emerge and who call themselves the Jews' messiahs because they want to lead a rebellion and overthrow the Roman Empire. And none of those are terribly successful. Some of the most successful ones only result in Rome having a huge and violent backlash. So what you actually see in the Roman rule of Judea, you see first lots of movement of Jews. Many Jews will take advantage of Roman citizenship and their positions of relative power within the Roman Empire as bureaucrats of Judea, and they will find their way up into the Roman system, and they end up moving around through the Roman Empire. Some flee the Roman Empire, which is how you get Jews down in Yemen. Jews fled to Mecca. That's going to come back to us when we talk about Islam. And then you also had Jews who fled to Ethiopia, Morocco. They went to China, and they went farther up into Turkey and later what would be Eastern Europe. And some of them stayed in Babylon. Or in Persia, right? So these are major centers of Jewish population kind of before the Romans really invade Palestine. But then what ends up happening is, yes, Jews have moved out. The bulk of them have stayed in Judea, and there is a major, major rebellion just before 70 CE. And in response to that one was almost successful. And so Rome is like, no way are we going to let this happen. So not only do they crack down on the rebellion, but they dismantle the temple so that they can remove the center of Jewish life. And that begins a kind of second phase of diaspora, because if there is no temple, then there is nothing that anchors the Jews to this place, other than the promise that this land was theirs. And that goes all the way back to Abraham, right? But what good is a promise that isn't visible in a lived reality? So this unmoors the Jews a second time, and they become a more mobile people. And what unifies them now is not so much their relationship to land or place, but their relationship to each other and to their culture and traditions. After this, Rome stops calling Judea, right? Because they have dispersed a lot of the Jews out of the area. And then you have the other non-Jewish peoples who live there. They're Syriac and Palestinians. And this region gets renamed Syria-Palestine. So this is what happens to the Jewish population after the destruction of the temple. They get shipped out all across the Roman Empire, right? Like they're just moved. And some of these slides should look familiar from an earlier lecture where we talked about diaspora. But as time goes on, medieval Judaism starts to take on a totally different character from what we know of ancient Judaism. So not only did they start migrating to Europe in the 4th century, right, under Rome, but they were unwelcome throughout a lot of Europe. And in particular, the more Christian a location was, more Catholic under Rome, because what we see here, right, let's back up a little bit, between this moment and this moment, between these moments, you have the emergence of Christianity, right? And at first, this is not a popular thing, and we will talk a little bit later. It takes a couple hundred years to become popular throughout the Roman Empire, but when it does, it becomes the official state religion in all of these areas. All of them. And so as the Jews are moving throughout Europe and North Africa, they encounter folks who are distinctly hostile to their way of being. There are pogroms. So hang on. There. Pogroms will remove Jews from the purge of Jews from places. And it's essentially get out or die. It is an ultimatum. And so this is a map of all the expulsions of Jews in various locations throughout medieval Europe. And that a lot of the times they end up moving someplace only to set down roots and then be told to get up and move elsewhere. So this is the origins of the Ashkenazi Jew, that's the name for European Jews. And even once Rome falls, the Visigoths actually exile them to Spain, which is a whole other situation that we're going to get a chance to talk about. And throughout medieval Christianity, the Jews are scapegoated as the slayers of Jesus, right? So the hatred is primarily religious. And then it becomes codified in a very particular way. So 1215 is the Fourth Lateran Council. Lots of things happened at Fourth Lateran. This is the one that's pertinent to this time, which is that the Jews were required to distinguish themselves from the rest of the population by wearing different clothing. Now, generally, their practices already distinguish them. So this is an early version of the yellow star, right? You must declare yourself as a non-Catholic by your dress. Anyhow, this doesn't get turned around until 1500 when the church is like, wait, but like our religion comes from Judaism, so we should respect them. We'll talk more about that when we talk about syncretism and supersessionism. The other key development is mysticism, which happens in most religions. Most religions develop a mystical arm, and many will also develop a fundamentalist arm. So this is the mystical arm. It develops during the European Middle Ages out of the tradition of the oral Torah and the commentary tradition. So we'll talk more about what that looks like. But the belief systems and the texts are always accumulating around how to understand the most ancient texts. And so instead of having just one ancient text, what you actually have are layers of traditions where you have the ancient text and then you have its interpretation and then you have the interpretation of the interpretation, and it goes on. And when you get to the 12th century and the emergence of mystical brotherhoods, this is another way in which medieval Jews are finding connections to their faith under conditions of duress in which the literal promises of their scriptures are not met. And so they develop a strategy for reading and understanding their faith that's not based in literal interpretation, but instead in a philosophical interpretation. And what they really fixate on is the relationship between the soul, darkness, the self, God, and then also the universal. So in the early modern period, after they get expelled from Spain, this practice, which gets called Kabbalah, ends up being banned. And then most Judaism takes a turn towards messianism, or messianic practices as opposed to mystical ones. And messianism is a more literal interpretation of their scriptures and their prophets. So modern Judaism and what it looks like in the world has three branches. There's Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. Reform Jews are a product of the 18th century and the Enlightenment, where they talk about essentially how do you keep this ancient tradition alive in this new modern world, and they make adaptations. And there's lots of different types of Reform Judaism. No two really look the same. It's not like a sect where these are governed by leadership and particular doctrines, but instead you have generally folks who believe that Judaism can be practiced believe that Judaism can be compatible with modern life. And then there's conservative Judaism, which is like, yeah, but, and so they reject a few of the Reform Jewish practices, and they tend to have a much more conservative worship practice, but also social practice. And then there is the Orthodox, which takes that to its farthest end. The Orthodox is the branch that sees itself as very separate. So as I mentioned earlier, there is fundamentalism in every faith. So when we talk about fundamentalism in Judaism, this is not an exception. This is not particular to them. This is just what their version of fundamentalism looks like. And fundamentalism tends to be a specifically modern phenomenon. And it happens because, just like in this case, Orthodox Judaism and their fundamentalist practice is a backlash against Reform Judaism. So is conservative, but they are just not as fundamentalist as the Orthodox are, right? So you see some folks who are making arguments for modernizing faith and its practice, and then you see some folks who very viscerally reject that. And then what they attempt to do is find some sort of fundamental core. That's why it's called fundamentalism, but they find a fundamental core that's not been corrupted. And I put that in asterisks because that is a very modern phenomenon. And we're going to see why when we talk about how the scriptures are formed. So secular Jews, just like secular Catholics, practicing Jews they're cultural Jews by like tradition and family and upbringing, but they don't necessarily practice their faith religiously. Then there's the Reform Jews. They are practicing. They do attend synagogue, but they also are part of the modern world. And then there's conservative. They are practicing and they are part of the modern world, but they hold it at an arm's length. Orthodox Judaism, on the other hand, is a more fundamentalist. Some forms of Orthodox Judaism are compatible with modern life. And so this is really important to understand. Modern Orthodox Jews, they do have specific limitations on dress and presentation, but they don't necessarily stand out in a crowd. So you can't necessarily look at a person and tell that they're Orthodox, because they wear normal clothes, normal Western attire. They just choose from that Western attire things that fit their religious practices. Also religious Zionists, folks who argue for and participate in the return to Israel as their promised land. They tend to also be compatible with modern life. Most of the government of Israel, for example, are religious Zionists, and they interact with the modern world. But then there are versions of Judaism that are not compatible with modern life. And just like the Amish or the Mennonites that you see in Christianity, they actually reject certain parts of modern life. And that separation of themselves, they also make visible in their dress and their habits and the way that they conduct themselves in public spaces. So not all Judaism is fundamentalist. Not all Orthodox Judaism is even fundamentalist. And not all fundamentalism is not meant to be a bad thing. It is just a descriptor of folks who find their practice of faith is rooted in a sense that they are returning to their religion's fundamentals, right? So I want to make sure before we end this lecture that we talk about anti-Semitism and the changes that it has gone through over time. It is a major issue again, for some reason. It came to a head in the Second World War in Hitler's Germany, but that didn't come out of nowhere. That anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust was not just because the German people or Hitler's Nazis were particularly evil. That's not at all the case. So in pre-Christian Greek and Roman culture, ancient culture, anti-Jewish sentiment was primarily ethnic, right? The Jews identified not only as a religion, but an ethnic group. And so the vitriol against them was ethnic in nature because other ethnic groups were hostile. And then Christian anti-Semitism that carried through the Middle Ages was rooted in religious nature, that scapegoating of the Jews as the murderers of Jesus, which is kind of illogical considering that they needed the murder of Jesus for it to all work. But that's another thing. Excuse me. Islamic anti-Semitism was different entirely. So Islamic culture and let's be careful here. Arabic culture and language is also Semitic, which means they share common origins with Hebrew culture. And so Muslim anti-Semitism is a very late development in many terms. And we'll talk more about this when we get to Islam. But Muhammad originally saw himself as a prophet in the Jewish tradition and started his preaching from a position of attempting to convert Jews. So under Muhammad's rule, Jews are protected. Like there is not supposed to be religious violence against anybody that belongs to an Abrahamic faith because they're brethren. So Islamic anti-Semitism comes much, much later. And then there's the political, social, and economic anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, which laid the groundwork for racial anti-Semitism. But this comes from that diaspora situation where Jews would end up in various parts of Europe, but then you also had Jews who took on very particular professions, and part of the reason they took on these professions is because those professions were forbidden by Christian doctrine. So as an example, Christianity forbade the lending of money at interest. And so in general, Christian states and peoples did not practice this, and yet sometimes people needed money. And so Jews Their religion did not forbid this practice, and they became known as moneylenders. That obviously put them in the position of being disliked, because nobody likes the person to whom they owe money, especially if they keep asking you to pay it back. But this social and structural position that the displaced Jews experienced in early modern Europe led to a racialization. And that's where we get in the 19th century, especially with the emergence of Darwin. And we've talked about this more than once, but the science of evolution turned into the science of eugenics. And Jews were deemed to be a, quote, and this is I should have put a content warning, inferior race, right? That is a load of bunk. But this is when somatic characteristics, so bodily characteristics, people, for example, would stereotype Jews based on skin tone, hair texture, physiognomy, which is facial features, and then they would get caricatured. And the fact that that racialization was located in their bodies led to a very different kind of prejudice, which is like literally racist anti-Semitism. And contemporary anti-Semitism is a weird mix of some of the above, not all. And it's interesting because in certain cultures and in certain places, Ashkenazi Jews have often been almost assimilated into whiteness and that identity until the very recent resurgence into the mainstream of neo-Nazi sentiment and action. And in that case, these folks who have emigrated to the United States and established themselves and become a part of essentially what is white culture, have been reminded that not everyone sees them as white, despite the fact that they are European. So there is a long history of anti-Semitism. It continues to this day, and it is on the rise. So this is a map from the Anti-Defamation League, which tracks anti-Semitic violence, and it shows you where that violence is happening. There absolutely is a link to this data visualization, and I'd be happy to share it. But if you look at it, you can see that even where we are, this is happening. And interestingly enough, the highest concentration of Jewish population in the United States is in New York. So it's not really surprising that there are anti-Semitic incidents here where there are a lot of Jewish people. There are not as many Jewish people in these locations, and yet look at the number of extremist murders of Jewish folks that happen in spaces near us. So disproportionately violent anti-Semitism in the area that we occupy. And that brings us to part 3. So I will stop this recording here.